Hello, beautiful people. I hope you guys are doing good today. So today on Game Theory Talk number 3, we are going to be discussing equilibrium. I would like to suggest to the recreational players that may not have the proper strategic framework to skip to about 2:30. It will be a little bit complex for the next 2 minutes over video, and we're going to play a great philosopher and see what he says.
Science. What is it all about? Technology. What is that all about? Is it good or is it whack? Will computers ever be able to work out what 99999999999999999999999999999999999 multiplied by 9999999? Yo, I ain't finished. You don't know what I was going to say. 999999999999999999999999999.
The answer is yes.
The most powerful computer in the world today does 36 trillion operations a second.
So would it be able to multiply 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10?
No, because I'm surprised at how illogical your question was, or your thinking
Yo,
was.
speak to that, because
Okay.
Space ain't listening, yo.
We're Homo sapiens, and that's about
Well, yo,
8 steps down.
I ain't. I just want to make clear, because this is going out on the TV or whatever, that I don't do that stuff. I ain't got nothing against it.
Oh, it's the homo that threw him off. I mean,
Yeah, you're
explain that.
It is a scientific nomenclature that describes who we are as part of a phyla or a stream of, it goes hominid, hominoid, and then we
Yo,
go
whatever,
through.
there's different names for it.
We're all
You
Homo
were-
sapiens.
All humans would be considered.
My wife is a Homo sapien.
But that's not homosexual.
We're all
That's where the
Homo
difference is.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's just a way of describing who we are.
Well, that's it. I just want to make clear your respect for coming on, and I ain't going to treat you differently now that has come out. That's.
Okay, well, I'm going to end it there because I could be entranced by his wisdom all day, but we must speak about equilibrium. Today we are going to talk about the world of poker and the concept of equilibrium. And it is very crucial to think about this concept for our strategic success, not only as a poker player, but in any field that we pursue. One way to grasp this concept is through understanding expected value, or at least it's one of the elements that we can think about it with. A fundamental principle that you could say guides us and guides our decisions at the table. So I want to think about a scenario where a player faces a decision on the river of whether to bluff or to check. And say the player's intuition may suggest that bluffing as a means to win the pot immediately is a good idea. However, it's very possible that this player just has a cognitive bias on the river one way or another, and he either does not want to bluff and feel the pain of losing, or he does want to bluff and he doesn't want to feel the pain of losing as well by not winning the pot. It sort of depends on our player. Each individual player, there's a lot that we can think about each player, but there are certain people who are believers, non-believers, who are much more interested in bluffing in these situations or not. I know that a lot of the mid-stakes poker players and high-stakes poker players, but less so high-stakes, may overcomplicate profiling players, but there are scenarios where a certain person will simply under-bluff because of what it means to them emotionally and how painful it is to simply make their opponent's range indifferent, coupled with their beliefs about people not exploiting them for this. So it makes them much more predictable, and it's much harder for them to adapt and realize, against this guy, actually, I do need to bluff. And vice versa. Some people will just be over bluffing because they simply have the belief that all players are under calling, I'm going to do this, and then there are some fairly easy ways to actually counter this, but this is mostly coming from their beliefs. And I think that it's important to actually have a very good baseline strategy and to understand where people are deviating. And in OneNote, if we know where they're deviating, it actually gives us tons of information as to how they think about the game and structure the game. Because no decisions are ever random. Every single decision, we have multiple options. And it always means something. The poker player is always speaking a language, and being able to understand this language does not require understanding equilibrium and game theory, but certainly it gives us a deeper framework to understand the meaning of these bets in a more intricate way. And this is what takes people from a very strong intermediate level to being extremely advanced, and not just somewhat advanced, but being top level is being able to synthesize this approach. So it's very important to evaluate the equilibrium strategy. So the player on this river must weigh the potential gains against the risks involved. Obviously very basic, but what does this actually mean? It doesn't mean that you're trying to win the hand at a higher percentage of the time. It means that you're thinking about the payoffs and all of the leaves, and considering how often you get there, and thinking about the product of that, and then leading this particular hand into that node that has the highest payoff. But also you have to consider, if your opponent sees you play this hand in a way, how will they adjust their strategy? And then how that will influence the expectation of different holdings that you have compared to them. So this is also another relevant thing that we have to be considering. When it comes to equilibrium play, our opponents are going to be aware of players' tendencies to bluff. They're going to be aware of our tendencies. They're going to be aware of their tendencies. So we cannot simply be playing our opponent and saying, well, I think he does this. We have to be very aware of what his average perception is against the pool based on how often he goes to showdown, how often is he calling river, how often is he RFIing preflop, how often is he 3-betting. This will lead us to more knowledge as to the way he thinks about the game. And this will give us information as to whether or not he thinks that most people on average are bluffing or under bluffing, etc. And then that will lead us to knowledge about us, because it's very unlikely that he just thinks about us in particular. It's very likely that he models this aggregate of people into how he sees the pool. Certainly in mid-stakes this is the case. Once you start to get to deeper a stronger strategic framework, and you understand player profiling and how they think deeper, not very many people are doing this at mid-stakes. I would more so categorize this as to the skill level of high-stakes players. But in essence, equilibrium in poker arises when player strategies are mutually optimal given their opponent's strategies, in the sense that you do not have incentive to unilaterally increase or change any strategic options. It will not decrease or increase your expectation. It's a very, very delicate balance where each decision influences the overall dynamics of the game. But trying to understand the interplay of EV and equilibrium, and it's not like these things are different, but the point is understanding what the EV is in the actual leaves of the tree. So, of course, we never can know what the equilibrium is. We can only make guesses, and these guesses are based on what we prioritize in game. So if we prioritize winning hands or not being bluffed or putting hands in this node and then not that node, there's always going to be a counter. There's always going to be a strategy that our opponent can play. And our goal is not to be able to create a trick or a strategy or a preemptive trick. Actually, we want to be able to understand all the tricks. Each strategy that we play will always have a different counter. And not only will it have a different counter, but there will be ways to hide information when we are playing this strategy so our opponents do not catch on. Most of the mid-stakes players don't even consider how important information hiding is. I'm not sure how much I actually want to talk about that. I certainly won't talk about it on this episode, but there's a lot that we can actually get that basically the entire poker community would never talk about in high-stakes training videos or mid-stakes training videos, simply because it's not worth it to put out there. And the majority of this understanding are not tricks that we learn, it's basically just through our own understanding and application of game theory. Anyways, I will continue talking about equilibrium. I need to think a little bit about which direction I want this conversation to go in. Okay, I was thinking about trying to talk about historical events and talking about equilibrium as it relates to this and making it a little bit more entertaining, but I kind of did that last episode, and I'd rather get into some of the bread and butter of actually the facts. Even though I think that's quite dry and not entertaining, I think having the facts so we could look at them Or maybe I'm just not a very good video producer and I'm not very creative, and a better writer would be able to mix the two. That would be a good argument, but I'm going to get into the facts anyways. So I want to talk about like what optimal play actually is. So there are basically two equivalent ways of looking at what optimal play is and defining a Nash equilibrium strategy pair. When we talk about optimal or equilibrium, it's in the context of a strategy pair. So like one way of defining this is saying that both strategies are maximally exploiting each other simultaneously. That makes sense, right? Okay, so the second definition is that neither player, you could say like, I would use the word unilaterally, but I'll just say neither player can change his strategy to improve his own expectation. Or you could say neither player can unilaterally change his strategy to increase his expectation. These are all equivalent statements. But basically, in No Limit Hold'em, the game is zero-sum. It is a two-player no limit, or if you're saying heads up, which is the easiest format to talk about, but it doesn't really matter. It is a very good format to look at because it is zero-sum. So all the value to one player is coming directly from another player. And the players' combined profits obviously have to sum to zero, again, barring the rake. So in equilibria, or an equilibrium, can be proven when neither of the players can unilaterally change their strategy in order to improve his EV, or their EV. Now, finding a situation that can be defined this way, you could say, is a pretty special set of circumstances, and it's not exactly obvious how such a strategy pair should always exist, especially in more complicated two-player games. Like, for instance, I was playing NBA 2K for 20 minutes yesterday, and I thought, like, how could this actually be modeled for game theory? I don't understand, and I always lose. I don't understand. But I was trying to think about how this thing can actually be, like, modeled, and I don't know how. Because I don't know how you'd model each decision point when, like, you just have a joystick and you're going, like, left, right, this, that. There's just infinite quadrillions of possibilities, way more than poker. And it's a 48-minute game. I mean, it's just infinitely more complex. So then there are certain, like, obviously we're not going to be able to model each node. We can start to think about, like, big concepts in this 48-minute game. However, actually, poker, I don't know that we would be able to model each decision with our moving joystick, but in poker, there are actually these things called like decision points where we have to choose like A, B, C, D, E, F, G, whatever, but it's still going to be like a definable choice. There was this guy named John Van Neumann, who is a game theorist, and he was the first one to actually prove the existence of strategy pairs in games such as like Heads Up, No Limit Hold'em. And it also extended to a variety of other game types. Maybe there will be some sort of game theorists that have a lot to say on video games. Maybe they already do, and I'm just ignorant, and I'm not well read enough on these types of games because I've mostly thought about game theory in terms of just poker, and then also I've thought about it a little bit in evolutionary terms as well, as far as how the brain works, but not video games. That would be a very interesting topic. If anybody has a video link, I would love to see it. But basically, the reason why we would ever even do an equilibrium strategy, it's not like obvious that we want to do equilibrium, right? Because if we're playing poker, we may have the assumption that if we're playing, we want to win. Now, some people are going to the poker table and they're actually having fun, and you could say that these things are not mutually exclusive. It's possible to have fun and make money at the same time. There's no reason why they should not be mutually exclusive, but I would argue that the vast majority of people that are playing poker, at least recreationally, do not necessarily expect to win large amounts of money. They might assume that they're breaking even or winning a little bit, but I don't think they're doing it for a living. And if you ask them, why are you not doing it for a living, maybe it's whatever the case is. But when we talk about opponents that are sufficiently intelligent in the sense that they're very well studied and they've thought about different strategies, they study hours a day, they think about how to get better at poker. We're talking about people that really want to improve. They will always adopt their strategies when they're facing another person who's basically sufficiently intelligent. And when I say sufficiently intelligent, I'm talking about like two dudes that are both capable of determining like a maximally exploitative and equilibrium strategy. Also they kind of have to be aware that the other one is capable of this as well. Actually, I mean, they don't have to, but this would be, them playing equilibrium would be predicated on this as well. I'm saying the last bit because this is important. If we think that our opponent is not aware of how strong we are, it's like far less likely that he will adopt an equilibrium strategy, and he's far more likely to actually attempt to exploit perceived weakness that he believes that we have, and then we can create a counter against that. So it's a little bit complicated, but yeah, I want to give a sort of example to make this a little bit more clear. Let me think. John and Joe. No, okay. Player A and B are playing a non-equilibrium strategy. From this definition, it means that at least one of them, say Joe, or say player A, will be able to change his strategy to improve his expectation. He likes to do this because he likes to make money. He likes to get paid, and then he likes to get laid. And his new exploitative strategy will give him an expectation greater or equal to his equilibrium one, right? Okay, so this should be obvious. Now, if it did not, then it would not be maximally exploitative, since he can achieve just the equilibrium value by playing his equilibrium strategy. Now, given this fact, at this point, unless they are now playing the equilibrium strategy, player B, again, we're saying we're A. Now, B has an expectation of less than equilibrium because it is a zero-sum game. Now, because he's also intelligent, he likes money, he can and he will adjust his own strategy and so on and so forth. So at any point during the game, one player will have incentive to change his strategy unless they are both playing with equilibrium ranges. Again, this is predicated on the assumption that they're both of equal skill level, and they know that as well. That last part is important. So more specifically, unless the values of the games, or in fact the value of the game for both players, or the equilibrium values, one player will necessarily be able to improve his EV by changing his strategy in some kind of way. And there are a lot of examples that I could go through, but I tend to rant and rave about examples. And by the way, if examples are good, then I'm very happy to provide them. If someone would like to tell me that that is the way that they learn better, then I'm very, very happy to. But often I give examples that go for about 5 minutes that aren't even to do with poker. I don't know, I'm a little bit insecure about that. Maybe it's actually like a good way to teach. But when I used to give examples to my friends, they were sometimes mean to me and they said, you should not give examples that way. It's too long and drawn out. But again, I guess they were also not poker players. So maybe that's part of it. But basically, part of equilibrium, we need to think about the fact that both players tend to play equilibrium strategies and have no incentive to actually deviate if they're generally about as good as each other. And Nash equilibrium is known as a solution type concept for the game of poker. So there are other types of games, say Six Max. There are other concepts that might make more sense to refer to compared to the solutions that we have for Heads Up No Limit. I don't know enough about 3-player plus games. I can only repeat knowledge that I've stored in memory based off of what other people have told me, but it seems much harder to be able to prove some of these equilibriums, and maybe it's just due to the computing power, but I'm too ignorant to speak on that. But I think that's a very, very interesting topic. And at some point, if I understand more about the way that this stuff works, then I would love to speak on it, very much so. So eventually with these kind of equilibrium strategies, you could say adjusting, and then again we have the equal skill level. We're going to not try to exploit our opponent, because if we try to exploit our opponent, it will lead to us potentially being exploited and blah blah blah. We will arrive at some sort of a happy medium where neither player is really going to do much to improve his expectation. Even if it's 0.1, 0.2 BB 100, remember the fish is losing something 35, 40 big blinds 100. So this is not worth very much. The point is to be able to play well against some of the regs and exploit the recreational player. A lot of the study time that people put in for poker is to specifically think about how to take money away from recreational players, and also had to play these different situations and reg dynamics. Reg versus reg, a lot of people just try to play equilibrium unless they're significantly better than their opposition, or they're a bit better. But this is very important to understand where the money comes from as well. We're not just learning GTO to be able to cling on to it as a safety mechanism. We also have to think about poker and how to exploit players for ourselves as well. And this is kind of these are the tools that we get. They're not kind of egoic defense mechanisms to be able to make us feel better. In fact, they're actually additions, or you could say that they give us new frames to be able to view the current knowledge in a sort of higher perspective. So it's important to be able to think about what happens and to be able to visualize kind of how this equilibrium actually arises, where we check back the flop with ace, good aces, and then, he's like, well, whenever he checks back and I probe, he always has an ace. So now I know that when he bets, he must be betting a bunch of crap. So I'm going to check raise him every single time. And then I realize, well, you know what? This is true. Well, I'm going to keep my aces in the check raise range, but when he check raises me, I'm going to call. And then the guy out of position that check raised the flop is like, well, I know that he normally folds, so I'm going to check. And now in position is going to bet. And we can keep adjusting our strategies. We don't even have to play pure strategy. We can adjust and adjust and adjust. And this is very, very important, but eventually we will arrive at some sort of a happy medium. So instead of switching all the way from one response, I'm always going to bet ace X on the flop, or I'm always going to check. In one iteration, you could say I'm going to do it 50% of the time or 70% of the time. And each player can adjust their strategy a little bit in that kind of direction, etc., etc. I mean, essentially, this kind of process of not going from 100 to 0, but going 50, 60, 70. Okay, well, we think it's worse. Okay, we're at 70. Well, we'll reduce it. We'll go down to 60 instead of go down to 30. Something like this. This makes the process more smooth and sort of in terms of thinking about equilibrium and strategies that we're going to play. And we can actually arrive at some pretty good, this is actually sort of how solvers work. There's this algorithm called fictitious play, and it resembles a process which maybe even God himself, aka Pile Solver, has been doing for a very long time, which is the way that all kind of these equilibrium solving softwares work. The poker gods, which I don't really believe in other fictitious gods, but I do believe in my god of Pile Solver. And if he was a woman, I would certainly marry him, but unfortunately he's not really interested in homosexuality. Because, he's a computer, isn't he? Or he's an algorithm, technically. But basically what Pile Solver actually does is the same method that we are talking about in terms of going from 0 to 50 to 80 to 70 when we're thinking about equilibrium. These different methods for discovering a Nash equilibrium. The approaches normally employ some sort of technique known as self-play. I'm going to play against myself, and imagine this algorithm that starts by randomly playing a game, refining a strategy by facing off against itself. And then basically what's happening is this algorithm begins randomly. I'm going to do this 100%. And then eventually he reaches the end and he's like, this made $50. It reflects on all the decisions it made in 1,000 hands, and it's well, this one made 80. I'm gonna do it this time. So then it starts to play more and more hands, and you could say contemplating which one is better, it opts for different actions by remembering which ones gave the highest EV. And since it's playing a copy against itself, it kind of engages in counterfactual reasoning. It goes okay, if I look at this action, the opponent responds with this action, and then I counter that with this move, but maybe I end up with 100 instead of 25. And then because of that, it updates the regret value for a particular action. Regret being a measure of how it wishes it had played an action in the past based off of its past knowledge of EV. So when we're faced with a similar situation in the future, the algorithm learns okay, well, I need to pick actions with higher regret. So doing so with higher probability. And this is this process continues and continues, and the algorithm gets smarter and smarter, and it basically accumulates more regrets for various scenarios. And over time, you could say now for a human, the time would be very different because the algorithm can just play quadrillions of hands, and it's very intelligent. It doesn't have any irrational stuff. It doesn't have to sleep. but by constantly favoring actions with a higher regret in the strategic manner, the algorithm is actually able to prove, well, it's able to come very, very close to proof of a Nash equilibrium. Now, I don't know. I'm not like an advanced enough game theorist, so you'll have to ask game theorists if it's actually able to be proven. I'm just using my imagination mostly when I'm talking. I don't necessarily remember exactly what I've read, so some of the things I could be saying are wrong, but I don't necessarily know if it's actually been proven to converge to a Nash equilibrium, but I don't think that it would be exploitable for almost anything, so it doesn't matter. This has no like relevance, like the fractal things have no relevance in terms of poker, because we're trying to get takeaways as to the meaning of Nash equilibrium so we can apply that to our understanding when we are playing the game. So this kind of method known as counterfactual regret minimalization, it isn't exclusive to self-play, but it's a principled approach to kind of like think about how to get Nash equilibria. And oh, there's my alarm. And it's I mean it applies to a lot of different types of complex games, and even imperfect information games like poker. You also have games like chess, which is, I don't know, I feel like self-play doesn't necessarily mean neural networks in terms of the well, it's a broader encompassing system as far as playing itself. And it's essentially a form of reinforcement learning. So these algorithms are essentially the same thing that human beings are using at some level. And here's kind of like an idea as well. Like a process of reasoning. What would the value have been if I had taken this other action instead? It's very similar to how like I learned when I was first playing poker. I would have asked my friends, like, what would you have done if I raised there and you had ace king? What would you have done with ace king? It's all about like learning from counterfactuals. So factuals. So it's like, I would be in a place and I raised with pocket jacks, and then this guy like re-raised all in, and I like lost a big pot, and then like I raised, and then like he re-raised, and then I called, and then I lost a small pot, and I'm like, well, what do you do with pocket jacks, my friend? This is basically how we learn, and it's no different than a solver. So trying to get some of the irrationality out of our mind and really understand the principles that a solver uses, or understanding how it works. It's not like it's how. It doesn't have a particular reason because it's an algorithm, right? But we are able to create concepts in our minds using words, using language, and be able to create a model to think about this idea of why things happen. Of course, why is only a human concept in the human mind. It's not like an existential reality, but certainly we are able to get something from these solvers. So learning the framework as to why things happen for us, getting a language so we are able to make better predictions in the future, this is very, very, very important for strategic play. Okay, so I want to think about kind of like a real world example and then relate this to poker, because this actual concept of equilibrium is not really just about poker. It really has nothing to do with poker. In fact, it's not like you can attach it to any particular thing. It is actually just an idea that we can use in poker to help us. So it's not like it's just restricted to poker. So I think giving us a more holistic example will actually be more beneficial to make more connections, not just to the compartmentalized knowledge that we have surrounding poker, but it will make us it will help us make more connections with the totality of our knowledge in our brain, and the other parts of our knowledge will also help us in poker, like understanding psychology of other people, why people are avoided in certain situations, from losing money, from being bluffed, etc. This will help us delve deeper into other people's psychology. So using real world examples, but hopefully I don't draw it out too much. But yeah, let's get started. So an example in like historical warfare, which is analogous to poker in some ways, was the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta around, I believe it was around 400 BC. So in this Peloponnesian War, the Spartans focused on a very land-based tactic because they were trying to avoid direct confrontation with the Athenians, who had a very, very good navy at that time. So this is very, very similar. It very much mirrors a cautious approach of a poker player who recognizes their weaker position in a situation with their range, and they are trying to, you could say, mitigate having to fold, mitigate being bluffed by just betting on the flop because they don't want to face a turn bet. But in actuality, they're making themselves more predictable, and they can probably get even more exploited by an aggressive opponent, because the aggressive opponent will realize that, okay, this bet range is far too strong, it's not folding enough, it means that you're not bluffing enough, it means you're putting bluffs into your check range, and now this aggressive opponent is going to try to attack this weaker portion of his range, which gives the aggressive opponent a higher value than his equilibrium EV, because originally this weak player was supposed to get paid with some value, and now the aggressive opponent is folding second pair because he knows this guy only has top pair plus, or he's folding third pair because he knows he only has second pair plus. And now when he checks, he's losing a lot more value. This is very, very, very similar to the way that the Spartans attempted to disengage at sea because they were very vulnerable compared to the Athenian navy, and the Athenians were very dominant in the sea. They are historically one of the greatest navies that has ever lived, relatively speaking, in terms of the states that we have nowadays, city-states, nations. Now in poker, a poker player who knows that they lack a very strong hand may seek to exploit their opponent's caution by betting very aggressively and applying pressure. Similarly, Athens, aware of the Spartans' hesitance to change their naval supremacy, capitalized on this very fact by expanding their navy and being able to influence more economic situations to get more resources. And in fact, they were able to get and cut off resources for the Spartans. So they were able to utilize that strategy very well. They both were picking tactics that they had the ability to use. It's the same as when we end up calling a 3-bet pre-flop, we are at a disadvantage. Our opponents have a stronger set of hands, so we are going to have to use different tactics and strategies to be able to figure out, okay, well, we know that they like to just barrel off with crazy aggression. They're just forcing themselves in all the way like a boxer, boom, 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 bam. But if they miss, how are we going to beat them? We need to be like Bruce Lee. We need to be like water. It's not like we're playing a hand. We're actually playing a strategy. It's important to remember the interactions between the Athenians and the Spartans during this Peloponnesian War, and think about the resemblance to poker's concept of balancing ranges and exploiting our opponent's tendency to over triple barrel. But when he ends up betting the flop and he checks the turn, he always gives up and he never bets the river. So what does that say about where we should put our resources to be able to attack different parts of his soldiers, his range? Everything leads to something else. Everything, these strategies arise simultaneously. We cannot think of one part of the game tree in isolation. So for instance, if an opponent in poker constantly overbets the flop, a skilled player might adjust by folding more often pre-flop to avoid unprofitable situations post-flop. He also might not 3-bet as often because he knows that in a 3-bet pot, this overbet on the flop by his opponent was predicated on the fact that he thought potentially that the 3-bet range was too strong to begin with, and that the call range was weak, and that it would overfold to overbet. So now maybe this strong player is going to put more of his soldiers around the fort to prevent these big attacks. It's very, very important to draw these analogies because equilibrium has nothing to do with only poker. It is simply a concept which has everything to do with life. So our decisions reflect our strategic calculation based on what we think our opponent's tendencies actually are, and the perceived strength of their range, where they think they are vulnerable and invulnerable, and where they are going to put counters. Similarly, in the Peloponnesian War, the Athenians adapted tactics to exploit the Spartans' weakness, such as a reliance on land-based warfare, and they leveraged their naval superiority. Athenians imposed blockades, they disrupted supply lines, they constructed raids around the entire coast of Peloponnnesia. And it really fucked with the Spartans' economic and military capabilities because they already dominated the sea, so they hit them where they're weak. Now imagine this. You're at a table, you're at Zoom, and you know that someone is generally just a nit. So you think, why is this guy a nit? What is his actual psychology? Well, he doesn't like putting money in and losing. Well, maybe this is because he has the perception that his opponents are actually just not bluffing enough, and he thinks that he is superior and he thinks he is exploiting them. Maybe he doesn't actually view himself as a nit. Maybe he views himself as someone who is exploiting people who don't bluff enough. So what does this mean? Say on average we think that, well, he's going to end up folding the river very often. Maybe we are going to put him into different nodes of the game tree where he gets to flop, he gets to turn, and then he gets to river, and he feels very proud that he ends up folding the river, and you know this about him, so you end up exploiting him. This is very, very, very similar to all of the war tactics that we use. Very often Napoleon knew when a general was too arrogant and knew that a general was not expecting a counter here because he thought there's no way this guy would ever try to take me on. And because of that, he sent reinforcements and other parts of his army into other areas that they shouldn't have been based on his own arrogance, and Napoleon absolutely took advantage of that. It is no different in poker whatsoever. So poker and warfare strategic decisions are all influenced by a complex interplay of different types of factors. And some of these factors are allocation of resources. Also, some of it is our generals or our opponents' sort of psychology, what their insecurities are, what they pride themselves on. Or are they proud of making big hero calls? Are they proud of making folds? Do they automatically fold against a bet on the river because they want you to know that you are actually under bluffing? Is that what they're trying to tell you? Or do they not think you're intelligent enough to know and they're just going to click fast? Or are they trying to trick you and they're trying to make you think that they don't care because they think that you're actually over bluffing, but they just have a missed draw and they plan on overcalling you? You have to be able to assess this kind of stuff. And what is the deal with their risk management? Are they playing above their stakes? Do they do this more often? This also has to do with countries where maybe a country will overextend themselves in the short term, but if you draw them out, eventually they will have to give up because they will not have the political backing. Just as a poker player has to very carefully consider their opponent's range and tendencies to make optimal decisions, military commanders also have to analyze the adversity and strengths and weaknesses of not only the other general in the army, but the political system, which is creating the capacity to fight in these battles. So the application to real-world concepts is very, very, very important. And the parallels between poker strategy and historical welfare, we have a wealth of knowledge about strategy which goes back 5,000 years of our written history, and we can certainly highlight the importance and adapt some of the capacities to deceive our opponents and think strategically and think about the fourplex or think in four-set in terms of laying counters in these kind of competitive environments like poker, where we are not simply playing chess for nothing. We are playing for dollars, and people want to improve and people want to get better. With the incoming of AI, it is absolutely imperative that we think very strategically about this game and we think about what our opponents are really trying to do holistically. We do not want to miss the forest for the trees. This is always the problem. In poker, yes, it's at a table, but it is absolutely a battlefield. Chess is no different than a battlefield. And success absolutely hinges on our ability to anticipate what our opponents are doing, and this forces us to think in terms of where the money is coming from in the leaves and where our opponent is going to lead us with what frequencies, because the frequencies are just the frequencies that he takes his actions. He has a different range, he has different hands. How often does he have ace king? What does he do with ace king in this situation? Well, what does he do with a bluff? So we model our opponents. We cannot use PioSolver for this. We actually have to understand game theory. By recognizing these kind of poker strategy parallels in military strategies, there's a lot of valuable insights that we can gain into the complexities of decision making, and these are absolutely timeless principles for competition. If we think that poker players are so absolutely fantastically unique, absolutely wrong. People have been sending millions of men to war and killing each other, and the greatest, very unfortunately disgusting stuff that our society does, but there's a lot to learn from military generals in terms of making cold, calculated decisions that save millions of lives. So it's important to understand the parallels between these things, and I'm going to try to approach game theory from a variety of perspectives. So we had a little story about how equilibrium is a concept that it's just not applicable to poker, but it gives us a better idea as to what the meaning of it is. At least we can think about it from a different perspective. But when we get to a poker table, it's interesting because there's an idea often that we should only play GTO first because we don't know what our opponent is going to do, and then as we get information, we can start to change our decisions. This is what I'm going to try to advocate, but I would also like to say that there's a caveat that this is not really true, because in reality no opponent is actually a complete unknown. For instance, if you're playing it like a casino, we can certainly make guesses as to the player's play style based on their age, based on their sex. If we're playing online, we can think about their location, we can think about their screen name. In both venues, we know our opponent's buy-in amount. So some recreational players, you could say, buy in for $50 or 50 big blinds. So there's also likely something to know about their general tendencies. If they're a little bit scared to lose money, they have $500 in their pocket, but they're only buying in $50 each time. It might mean that he may end up over-folding pre-flop because he's scared to put money in, or maybe he ends up putting money in pre-flop, but by the river he doesn't call. This is going to help us make some educated guesses about our opponent's play right from the start, and certainly we cannot say we have no information about this guy. I mean, that would certainly be very silly, because there are a lot of ways to kind of argue against this assertion. So we can definitely gather some information off the bat and then adopt some exploitative strategy, but we want to think about what information we're really using. There was a guy named Maxwell Fitz. He was a very good hyper turbo heads up no limit player, and he coined the term population tendencies, and it basically refers to the strategy of an average opponent in a very specific player pool, say 500 zoom. The population tendency on this board A7-2 is to put a little bit too much air into it relative to equilibrium and check back a few too many hands that are above 90% but less than or more than 70%. So like you could say this is a population tendency, but this is not really like we are playing a real opponent. So we need to think about what the application of this is. We can think about it conceptually, and this approach to a match is fine. But again, we need to understand the meaning of these things. So we start out by considering GTO play. We make some assumptions about how villain is likely to deviate from it. And then we begin to exploit those deviations. Now, it is just that by considering the average tendencies of the players in our games rather than those of our specific opponent, we're already going to be getting some information, but it's possible that our opponent anticipates this as well, and then maybe he plays counters for people that are mostly playing my strategy, and maybe most of the players that he plays are rigs that are already picking up on this tendency. So we want to be able to think about this from a variety of vantage points. So I just wanted to add this caveat about the fact that we can always get some sort of information, even if they have never made a decision that we've seen. We can start gathering information, and that is one of the that is a very large portion of the tools that we need to make money as a poker player, is to gather information and then integrate it. into decisions that make us dollars. So, anyways, guys, it has been about 35 minutes. I'm going to call this an episode. I love you all very much, and I will speak with you soon.